This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
It is 3 minutes after 10 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. As I mentioned a moment ago, we were already preparing to talk about Joe Biden's visit to Israel. I noticed Benjamin Netanyahu thanking him for his unequivocal support, which isn't true, is it? I mean, unequivocal would say you do whatever you want. Don't worry about international law. I think that equivocal and law is probably synonymous in this occasion. But that was part of the reason why I wondered what you thought the purpose of this visit was. And then he made that. I don't know how big a deal it is. It just seems a rather infelicitous thing to say, doesn't it? It looks like it was the other team. Twitter was appalling last night, and I make no apology for citing Twitter as an example or an exemplar even of the place to go for breaking news. If you think back a year or 2 years, it was wonderful. I mean, it can be an absolute sewer on occasions, but it was so good on breaking news because of the verification system. So you knew that almost everybody who had a blue tick would be working for a reputable news organization. In the context of bulletins coming from world's trouble spots, you know, obviously you also get a blue tick if you're a superstar singer and stuff like that. But if you were looking at claims or reports, or you were looking at tweets claiming to be reports, it was fairly easy to establish whether or not it was coming from somebody who had, credibility. God, it was awful last night. You can't use it anymore to track breaking news, which is odd because we've got so used to using it. It leaves quite a big hole. And some people, when this dreadful hospital explosion, hospital blast started being reported, it was reported as if people knew what they were talking about. It was reported as if the facts had already been established, and the facts still haven't been established. It's 12 hours later, and it is into that confusion that Joe Biden just waded. My following of it, and I stress again that it has not been established beyond any doubt, but in the small hours, I would suggest that the reputable reporting increasingly reflected the possibility that it was a rocket or a missile fired from within Gaza that had misfired, or whatever the correct terminology is. That is a reflection of the reporting, the credible reporting. But it began very much, I would say, the other way around, with organizations that should have known better, essentially reporting the claims of what is, after all, a proscribed terrorist organization, whether you call it that or not. That is what Hamas is legally in this country. But of course, we also know that historically the first reports of atrocities or events such as this, whoever is making the claims, sometimes turn out not to be true. In fact, as I tell you every morning, I look at both screens. I've got an Israeli military spokesman using diagrams and pictures to claim that Hamas is now hiding what really happened. So I don't know. I've told you what I've seen. I've told you what I've absorbed. But I do know this. I do know that Joe Biden just said that from the information that he's seen so far, it looks like the other side, the other team did it. And he has said that in Israel. So he means, obviously, Hamas. I don't know whether we should get too distracted by that. It seems an unfortunate turn of phrase. Biden seems a very tired and exhausted fella, doesn't he, at his age, that length of flight and all the rest of it. But, you know, he is the president of the United States, and therefore his intervention, the intervention of the office, never mind the individual, remains of paramount importance. So I don't know, actually. It's 8 minutes after 10. It's only happened in the last hour. I don't know how big a deal it is that he's chosen to deploy that language in this context. So we'll leave that. We can explore that together perhaps today. I genuinely don't know. I haven't got a strong view on it. I don't think it was a clever thing to say particularly, but I don't know. So I don't think it was a good thing to say, but I've got no real bead on how bad a thing it might have been. 8 minutes after 10 is the time. So here's the question, and this is a question that is very, very open-ended, I think. I don't know that we'll get two similar answers or two identical answers. Joe Biden has flown to Israel. Israel is embarked and embarking upon an unprecedented attack upon Gaza in pursuit of Hamas terrorists who contributed to or masterminded an atrocity of unprecedented horror just a week and a half ago. Why is Joe Biden going seems simultaneously to be a really simple question and a startlingly complicated one. Why is Joe Biden in Israel today? And here are two very different questions, which I don't think admit similar answers. What is he hoping to achieve? What is he hoping to achieve? 0345 6060 973. And what do you want him to achieve, or what do you want him to do? There could be two very different things there. Just because of you'd call it almost the human toll of tragedy, I would like him to somehow reduce the amount of carnage that is about to be inflicted upon Gaza. But as I've said to you on countless occasions in the last week and a half, it's very easy for me to say that because I don't live under constant threat of a Hamas attack. I don't believe it's particularly plausible to take Hamas out completely, although some commentators I respect suggest that perhaps it is. The bit I don't understand and I don't see them explaining is the inheritance, the fact that even if you took out everybody who's currently got a Hamas membership card, you create 2, 3, 4 generations of young people in Gaza who will move into that radicalized space as a consequence of watching the carnage that is already unfolding. So the plausibility of the mission statement troubles me, and the mission troubles me, but I'm on the outside looking in. And the inevitability of response or revenge or retaliation or whatever you're going to call it seems to me to be inarguable. So apart from the fact that we can all thank whatever God we may believe in that Donald Trump is nowhere near power at a time like this, everything else, it seems to me, is confusing and up for grabs. Why do you think Joe Biden is in Israel? 0345 6060 973. And what do you want him to achieve while he's there? What for you personally, not geopolitically or internationally, but for you personally, what would be a successful trip for Joe Biden? What would make this trip to Israel a success? Because I think for Benjamin Netanyahu, his use there of the word unequivocal, and I only saw it in a subtitle on my screen because obviously I don't have the sound on in the studio. That would be very weird. I just saw the use of the word unequivocal, and that struck me as a little bit tricky. Because you can't offer unequivocal support, I don't think, to a mission that is already accused of breaching international law, to an administration that is already being accused of war crimes. I'm not a judge, but the accusation has some weight. It may not have enough weight to secure a conviction, but the notion of collective punishment, the cutting off of water, energy and food fits the description of an allegation of a war crime. So you can't really wade into that environment, I don't believe, and offer unequivocal support. And I'm not sure at this point that Joe Biden has done that. I don't personally think he has offered unequivocal support. Rishi Sunak came close in the early days. He was talking about an absolute right to defend itself, which is a little bit mealy-mouthed. There is no such thing as an absolute right to defend yourself in logistic and military terms. It doesn't mean you can do absolutely anything. But he's moderated that subsequently, talking also about the importance of protecting civilians in Gaza. But the question stands, what would success look like for Joe Biden? And indeed, what would it look like for you? And listen, Idiot's Corner would be inappropriate today, but if you haven't double, triple and quadruple checked whatever it is that you are thinking of texting to me, or more importantly, whatever it is you are choosing to believe about this explosion at this hospital, then you are actually doing a grave disservice to the dead, I would suggest. And at the very, very least, we all owe them caution in concluding what has happened. A rush to judgment is often wrong. So I would go as far as to say that you insult the memory of the people who have died by claiming certainty already, by claiming an impossible certainty about what happened. And I you know, had to keep a very even keel throughout the last week and a half, had to be very, very careful, and rightly so, as we wade into incredibly complicated and heartbreaking territory. But the closest I get to losing my patience, I think, is with people who are insisting that they know exactly what happened in circumstances where it is currently impossible to do so. So that's the question for today. Why is Joe Biden there? What would success look like for him? And what would success look like for you? Because if he makes no meaningful impact upon what follows, he ends up looking very, very ineffectual and possibly even slightly ridiculous.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
18 minutes after 10. Why is Joe Biden in Israel from his point of view? And what do you want him to do while he's there from your point of view? Let's start in Manchester. That's where Lee is. Lee, what would you like to say?
Morning, Richard. Yeah, for me, the only...
That's the first.
Look, no, sorry, my radio just come back on.
Okay, well, you sort that out, and I'll crack on. But I will come back. It's too clumsy. That also, make sure he knows my name. You know, I'm a humble chap. Who's Richard? Rita's in Finchley. Rita, what would you like to say?
Hi, good morning, James. I think I'm in a position where I'm a Jewish Iranian person. So I identified 3 objectives listening briefly to your conversation just now.
Yes.
Number 1, prevent World War III in terms of Iran's involvement.
You mean an escalation, essentially going global?
Yes.
Yeah.
Number 2, to release the hostages. Number 3, to obtain and facilitate a corridor in which to help the people in Gaza, primarily by its neighbour, Egypt.
This is what you want him to do? Because
That's what I think is the main objective that should be done at this stage.
I don't know if 2 and 3 are.
World. Pardon?
I don't know if 2 and 3 are, because he's not going to be talking to. Well, he's not going to be talking to the hostage takers, is he?
Is he not going to be talking to the leader of Egypt?
Yes, but not the hostage takers.
No.
So I don't know how he would affect.
It's not possible.
I don't know how he would affect the release of the hostages.
I don't know.
No, I don't know either. But you're right about the escalation. Sorry, carry on.
We must assume that some conversations have taken place before him actually agreeing to travel to the Middle East.
Oh, of course, yes, of course. What do you want him to achieve?
I think it's unfair of the media to say it's one side or the other. Just wait, hold your horses to say who fired the missile. It could be a number of scenarios.
I think most media.
We don't have the evidence.
I think
concrete evidence.
Yeah, I don't know if you can hear me speaking because you can. Oh, good. I think most media this morning is being a little bit more responsible. I don't know about you, but I got my head twisted by Twitter last night, or whatever it's called this week, and people and organisations who really should have known better, essentially reporting what one side said as if it were fact. It's a heck of a lot more confusing now. And certainly on this programme, we won't be going anywhere until there is a proper certainty, proper credible certainty about exactly what has happened. So I think point 1 stands clearly and entirely. He seeks to stop the conflict going global. I'd recommend Roger Boyes in the Times on this today, and he brings in Ukraine and Taiwan to the question, not just Iran and Hezbollah. So that's a kind of scary prospect. But what does that mean?
Interject by stating and asking the question, why will Egypt not allow the border to be opened to assist.
And I think that phone line's gone as well. It's one of those days, isn't it? I wonder if it's Andy's in Wandsworth. Andy, what would you like to say?
I think there's two reasons why he chose to go to Israel. The first was before the bombing last night was probably to secure some kind of humanitarian deal between Israel and Palestine, and to get the border crossing open with Egypt. And obviously, after what happened last night, more importantly now is to show that the world, especially Iran, that the US stands unequivocally behind Israel, and shows strong support both militarily and
why have the unconfirmed events of last night changed any of that?
Well, initially he was going to go and see the Palestinian president as well, and obviously that's not going to happen now.
Why not?
Well, the Palestinian president is having a 3-day mourning, so he cancelled the meeting between Biden and himself. So now the success of this now would be if he sees the Egyptian president and gets that border crossing open. I think that's probably his objective now. If they can get the border crossing open and get humanitarian relief in, I would assume that would be a sign of success.
I don't know whether that's going to hold, is it? Because I think it was Jordan that cancelled the summit in Amman, wasn't it?
Well, it was Jordan hosting it, but yeah. it was actually the Palestinian president who pulled out first.
And if it turns out that the hospital tragedy was not the doing of Israel, then the reasons for pulling out change, don't they?
Well, you would assume so, but yeah. I mean...
Not the reasons for mourning. I mean, we need to be clear in many ways. That's the point about this whole sorry mess, isn't it? Yeah, of course you can.
Can I just say, last night, I monitor, for my job, I monitor pretty much every news network that there is. And I was watching live when that hospital got bombed. And I'm telling you, within 15 to 20 minutes, there was about 8 Arab countries, as well as Russia, all saying it was Israel that conducted that.
And Jeremy Corbyn.
And Jeremy Corbyn, there you go.
Yes.
So, I mean, as soon as that hit, I thought to myself, there's absolutely no way a logical country who, at the moment, kind of, I mean, they're on dodgy ground, but they kind of have a moral authority to...
Or at least they're desperately trying to establish a moral authority.
Exactly.
Yes.
But, I mean, there's no way that a country would do that.
Not deliberately.
Hospital. I mean, that was the other thing I was going to say. The only way I think Israel would have done that would have been if it was some kind of mistake. But, you can only go by what you're given, and what we got given this morning kind of gives you evidence to suggest otherwise.
Let me take you back, if I may. Yes, the balance of evidence has gone in the other direction as things stand, but no conclusions have been reached, which is a couple of people are reminding me, which Joe Biden also acknowledged. I did say that in my introduction. Further investigation is needed. He just described what he thinks it currently looks like. Can I take you back to that word unequivocal and what you mean by it?
I think when it comes to there's one Jewish country in the whole world, and I think that America stands completely 100% behind them. And you will never be elected President of the United States if you don't, I think. Correct. It's probably fair to say. That is definitely correct. Yes. Yeah. The amount of the Jewish population in North America is huge. But what does unequivocal mean? I mean, do you mean whatever happens, even if war crimes are committed or have been committed, then Biden stays silent? I think they will always support them militarily, even if there's war crimes committed. But I think obviously they would call them out heavily if they're, I think the leadership of Israel would be called out heavily if any kind of war crimes were committed. But I think in terms of military, there's no way America would not back them. And 100%. In terms of what's measurable, we can see, we can watch. In fact, you clearly will be watching it in real time, whether an escalation begins to unfold, whether or not the conflict goes global, mutation possible with conflicts over Ukraine and Taiwan. It's why your mention of Russia a moment ago is pertinent. So we can watch that, we can measure that, but we're not going to get a proper bead on it for
days at least, weeks probably, the Rafah crossing, the crossing into Egypt, whether to allow the egress of Palestinians or the ingress of aid. That's something we can watch and we can measure as well, isn't it? We can see whether or not that is actually happening. If Joe Biden goes home having only, well, what if he doesn't secure even that? I mean, some people will be hoping for some sort of ceasefire. I think your position is that that's impossible. It may have been possible yesterday lunchtime, but it's not possible today.
Yeah, I don't think there's any chance of that. But I think getting that border crossing open, getting humanitarian relief into southern Gaza would be a success now. But in terms of, I mean, if you think about who the real winners are in this whole situation, the real winners are Russia and Iran. Because Iran didn't want a peace deal between Saudi Arabia and
Iran, yes.
And Russia. I mean, they're clear winners because now all the spotlight is off of Ukraine and it's now in the Middle East. And also, America was already struggling to get finance through to Ukraine to secure more weapons through the Congress. And now, the Congress is always going to support Israel over Ukraine. So now there's even more, even more things behind that. So, the real winners are those. So, I mean, I implore listeners to think about that. And in the time going forward, I think we're going to be hearing more about, especially Iran. I anticipate there'll be sanctions on Iran for financing and supporting Hamas. And it's petrifying to think that, they're going to be getting a nuclear weapon probably in the next year or two.
And this is why the fears of the global conflict are pretty acute, even though they sound abstract at the moment. They will be anything but for the people. What do you do for a living? Can I ask? I'm just intrigued by your relationship with news broadcasting. You don't have to tell me.
No, I'm a trader. I did speak to you once before, actually, regarding the gilt market.
Oh, of course. So you're watching everything to see what it's likely to do to the financial market.
Exactly, especially oil prices, yeah.
Yeah, no, I understand that, and I find it fascinating, actually. I really do. It is 29 minutes after 10. Thank you, Andy. That was really helpful. And, of course, you have the distinction, if you like, between what Joe Biden would consider to be a success and what you would consider to be a success. I'd quite like a ceasefire, for example. I'd like people to stop dying. I'd like people to stop being killed, or whoever they are, wherever they are. But the idea of not responding to what happened in Israel last weekend, or even perhaps not responding further to what happened in Israel last weekend, or even perhaps not doing everything that is humanly possible to reduce, minimize, or remove the possibility of anything similar happening at any point in the future, is also a priority. So, there's dissonance here. There's inevitable dissonance. It's why I think I reserve my greatest impatience and disapproval for people claiming certainty about anything, really, at a time like this, not least the tragedy at the hospital overnight. It's coming up to 10:30. Thomas Watts has your headline.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 33 minutes after 10. It's difficult, writes Caroline, to see how there can be anything except escalation into a wider conflict now, threatening global security, without an immediate ceasefire. It's incredibly worrying. It certainly is. That's something people may want to comment on. As I mentioned, Roger Boys in The Times is very good today on the prospects of the conflict going global. He writes, beyond this performative diplomacy, which is, the sort of photo opportunities and the public urgings of restraint, there is a strategic priority, namely to prevent the Gaza war from turning into an all-out regional bust-up. So he writes that America's already neck-deep in the Ukraine war, which is 600 days old, and getting more ragged and more prone to a sudden Russian escalation. Hints that Moscow might move into Moldova or prod the eastern flank of NATO, add to those fears. Gaza itself could spill over with 100,000 Hezbollah members, the best armed irregular force in the Middle East, massed on Israel's other border. Iran, the patron of Hezbollah, the supporter of Hamas, could stir up trouble in Yemen and Iraq. All of these, writes Roger Boys, concerted proxy actions could could put paid to Biden's longer-term dream of an American exit from the Middle East. And the other point that needs to be made, and the search for trusted sources is so important at the moment. I'll recommend a few. Shashank Joshi, who's the defense editor at The Economist, is one that always manages to cut through much or most or possibly all of the noise. He tweets at SHASHJ, so ShashJ. And he writes, the evidence this morning, though not conclusive by any means, points more towards a failed rocket launch than an Israeli airstrike. Last night's rush to judgment, including by major regional powers, was premature, cynical and irresponsible. More evidence still needed. So I think you're looking at the United Arab Emirates, you're certainly looking at Turkey and Iran, Jordan and Egypt, all moved immediately to blame Israel, as did some public figures in this country on social media. If that turns out to be wrong, then there will be some very serious questions to ask and indeed answer. Let's go to Swansea. Tammy's in Swansea. Tammy, what would you like to say?
Yeah, hi James. I'm a first time caller.
Welcome.
So I might be a little bit nervous.
You picked a nice, simple, straightforward topic with no prospect of upsetting anybody or provoking any controversies. Well done, Tammy.
It's actually crazy in that I feel globally and even in our own moral, our moral spaces,
yes,
the topic is one which is quite like walking on thin ice.
Very much so.
And I wanted to make a comment regarding the previous caller when you mentioned that the United States unequivocal support for Israel.
But that's what Benjamin Netanyahu said. I don't know that I have heard those words coming from Joe Biden's mouth.
I wouldn't even agree with him on that because the events of the past do not say that, do not agree with that statement.
Yes. Because
if you check out under Barack Obama's presidency, remember there was a lot of friction with Israel. Even Biden had a bone to pick with Israel until the unfortunate events of October 7th.
Yes,
where Netanyahu was not going to he was trying to get a meeting to go to the United States, but they wouldn't give him a meeting with the White House. He only got to meet Biden on the flanks of the United Nations, one of these events, basically. So the diplomatic recognition had been scaled down.
Yes.
One, because of the right-wing government and the judicial reforms that was going on in Israel, and which also fed into the settlement expansion, basically.
Yes.
And the clashes that were going on. So it wasn't unequivocal. They were being reprimanded in some way by the United States.
That's a great point.
However, the events of October 7th, right, just changed the whole equation.
Yes.
Just like the news yesterday of the bombing, which many press organizations were so irresponsible in their reporting,
yes,
also changed the dynamic of Joe Biden's visit. Let's not forget that a lot of countries, while we have global global order, basically, and the interaction between those different governments, a lot of the heads of government are still responsible to their own people, and they have to take into consideration the domestic situation or the temperature of their domestic politics. Now, where we have a report where they were supposed to, Biden was supposed to meet with Mahmoud Abbas, the King of Jordan, and territories which have a lot of support for the Palestinian cause, and actually already feel outraged with what's going on with the airstrikes and all, where they now get the report that Israel has struck a hospital in Gaza, making it look like it was a direct Israeli airstrike, without understanding that when there is war going on or violence between two different nations, there is something called propaganda. Propaganda is part of war.
Of course.
And this means that the press need to be very, very careful with verification of information. You cannot just go on and then just place things that will inflame tensions, and that's what happened.
King Abdullah of Jordan blamed Israel for the blast at the hospital, and I think Mohammed Abbas's decision to withdraw from this meeting with Joe Biden was in protest at it. So if it turns out that is not the case, and for people who don't follow things as closely as you, Temi, I suppose explanation rather than excuse of why so many people went with this version of events. It was reported as according to the health ministry in Gaza, but that of course that of course, perhaps some people don't understand, that translates pretty much directly as according to Hamas.
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head, as you always do. You see, you see, most of the times, because I have areas where I disagree with you sometimes too. Now, that's exactly what I'm saying. Yeah. Now, imagine, James, right? There's something I always tell people, right? And for me, it comes from when I was growing up as a Christian in Nigeria.
Right.
And one law is this that says, I love your neighbor as yourself.
Yes.
Now, for me, I feel the practical application of that means that I have to take myself out of my body and superimpose myself in the other person's body, because your neighbor is anybody and everybody. Now, if you put yourself in Mahmoud Abbas's shoes, you were going to have that meeting, right?
Yes.
And everybody in your country just heard that their relatives, people, their own people have just been needlessly killed, right? While seeking care, refuge, and solace in a hospital. Now, and then you now say that, well, that's and then everybody's on the streets, right? While a lot of people are still contesting the tactics of the Fatah party, basically saying that they are not holding up strong enough, and then that's going on. Then you think that he's going to go have a meeting in Jordan and he'll come back and have his seat as the president of the West Bank, as the head of the Fatah party. So those things that need to be taken into consideration, and that means that we have to make sure that we are not fanning the flames of these things any further.
It's beautifully explained, actually, and it renders the importance of establishing immediately what happened last night, I mean, unimaginably high, doesn't it? It's hugely important.
Very, very, because remember, the what do we call it now? Is it the butterfly effect?
Yes,
where small things just can turn into a huge tornado, and that's what happened with World War One. It started with the shooting of Archduke Ferdinand, who knew that that it was going to consume the whole world, basically. So, but my main point here is that what I would wish to happen is a huge de-escalation of the situation. And it means that everybody has to put on their thinking cap. Everybody's so emotional right now.
Yes.
Everybody. Don't get me wrong. I have no time for Hamas. They are a terrorist organization, and I feel that, they should be kicked out. I hope to God that there are a group of people in Gaza who are working to say that these people cannot represent us after what they did on the 7th of October. I hope to God that that's the situation, because in Israel, you can say, okay, yes, there's a right-wing government, but then you still have people who are protesting against that government. Even on the 7th, there was a major protest that was being planned, basically, against Netanyahu and his government. But the fact this massacre basically just made everybody, you have to just circle the wagon.
Yes.
I think Hamas has achieved a lot from what they've done, and I also feel that the standard to which we hold Israel, right, may be the reason why a lot of people are just so quick to be like, if it's an explosion, it must be Israel.
Yes.
And let's not forget that Hamas using their own people as human shields is a fact.
Yes, it is.
And the point that you need look no further than the fact that they had to kill one of their leaders in a United Nations refugee camp. That was that yesterday. What was a Hamas leader doing in a United Nations refugee camp?
Well, I've got to take a break. Tell me, you've used up all my space.
I apologize.
No, I don't want you to apologize. I'm apologizing to you for not letting you to go further. But I feel you've covered an awful lot of ground in a very informed and measured way. But if I take, the headline of your contribution would be pause and caution, think before acting. And of course, in the context of this conflict, never mind this conversation, that remains relatively thin on the ground. Thank you, Temi. Cutting some slack there for Joe Biden as well, who might be described by Benjamin Netanyahu as being in Israel to offer unequivocal support, but whose intention to meet in Amman with the Egyptian, the Palestinian Authority and the Jordanian leaders spoke of a desire to achieve something else. It's the suspension or the cancellation of that meeting that is perhaps the driest tinder in this whole picture today. I don't mean, the bigger picture. I mean today's picture with Biden landing in Israel just hours ago. Temi, thank you. A lot of compliments coming in for you on my inbox, understandably. 10:46 is the time.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10:49. I think you find it interesting. I certainly find it helpful to chronicle how some of the problems happen, if you like, if you prefer. And here's a really good example. And I'll share this with you just before blocking the relevant account. It's a reply to a tweet complimenting the quality of the callers on this program today, to which an account with lots of numbers in it and very little history founded in the last few days has replied by saying, "You mean they give you what you wanted to hear?" And it cites two separate tweets from Médecins Sans Frontières, one of which details their horror at the recent bombing of the hospital in Gaza City. And they describe it as the Israeli bombing, which of course a lot of other foreign countries have done as well. And it sits alongside another tweet in which Médecins Sans Frontières revealed that Israel had given a hospital in Gaza just 2 hours to evacuate. So you're supposed to read that and think, well, that proves it was Israel that did it. The problem with, and just let me block this account and report it for misinformation. The problem is that it's two completely different hospitals 4 days apart. So it proves precisely nothing, except, I think, for me at least, and I speak only for myself, but the idea that surely hospitals should be exempted from any form of order for evacuation, to which some people will respond by saying, yes, but they're full of terrorists, or they hide bombs there, or they hide themselves there. I say, what do you do next? And while we're sort of flirting with entry into Idiot's Corner, I'll read this one as well. You all ran unverified IDF claims as front page news stories, and now you want to talk about fact-checking and corroboration. Well, again, I hope you find somewhere nice to sit in Idiot's Corner, but I didn't run any unverified IDF claims as front page news stories. And even the newspapers that did, I felt ill-advisedly, put it all in quotes. You're thinking specifically, and I apologise for reminding you of this, you're thinking specifically of the claim that babies had been beheaded. It was in all the newspaper coverage I saw, which wasn't all of it, and no doubt some were less responsible, but even the newspapers that I routinely lambast put the claim in quotes because it was a claim, whereas none of what I was seeing last night, particularly coming from Middle Eastern governments, including Jordan, none of that was put in quotes. There were no quotes on a tweet from the former leader of the Labour Party. So it's not the same. But the fact that you want it to be the same makes you dangerous. Because even if one side is doing awful things, the suggestion that means the other side should too just means you double the amount of awful things happening. I know that's a little naive, but it's also a little true. Ron's in Kensington. Ron, what would you like to say?
First of all, I would like to thank you for being so... I'm Jewish, I'm British, I'm Canadian, and I've been living in the UK now for almost 14 years now. And I would like to thank you for being so, I would say, unbiased, being very neutral on the whole situation and hearing both sides and not judging. And what I found last night, I was at home with my family, my kids were doing their homework, and my wife and I were sitting watching the news like most people, glued to the television. And, first of all, Sky came on saying that 500 people were killed. Then BBC said 200 people were killed. Then CNN said 100 to 200 people were killed. And then you started seeing all these rockets. First of all, Israel. Let's first start with the fact that Israel would have to be ridiculous politically and on a personal level as a country to go and bomb a hospital without warning or even have a misfire of rockets. when you
they wouldn't have control over a misfire, would they?
No, but I mean, let's look at it like this. When you look at all the previous rockets they fired, they've had no misfires. They've pinpointed an apartment in a building if they wanted to take someone out, a suspect. You would see all the pictures.
But they've also, I think there've been accidental deaths, haven't there, since this started, including in a convoy trying to follow the instruction to get out of northern Gaza into southern Gaza. But I mean, ordnance of the kind of scale that we seemed to be talking about last night being misfired, I grant you the chances are slim, and the idea of it being deliberate. Yes. I just want to pause briefly and ask you a question, Ron, because you glossed over a little the idea of bombing a hospital without warning. How do you feel about bombing hospitals with warning?
I feel that they shouldn't bomb hospitals to begin with. I feel that if these hospitals are harboring, terrorists or suspects or their weapons.
If Israel thinks or says they are harboring.
Yeah, no, of course. Yeah. I mean, I called up more to talk about Biden.
Sure.
Okay, I called to talk about Biden, and I think, as my father, who passed away recently, used to always say to me, thank you, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. And I think
William Blake might have beaten him to that, Ron, but I don't want to malign the memory of your late father.
But, Biden came with very good intentions.
Yes.
And I think Mahmoud Abbas is going to regret biting the hand that feeds him. So will Egypt, and so will Jordan.
You mean by cancelling this meeting?
Yes, I mean It's an insult to America. It's an insult to Biden. He's coming there with an olive branch out to try and find a peaceful resolution or discuss the Palestinian problem and what's going on in the Middle East. And I think it's disrespectful to Joe Biden to not even sit down and hear him out in this type of a situation. What interests me is how Mahmoud Abbas, who's not really a religious, man, if you see him, and I followed him for years. I lived in Israel myself when he was, taken over from Arafat as the head of the, Fatah and Palestinian Authority. Why is he choosing a 3-day of mourning now? Why was there no 3-day of mourning when 1,500 or 2,000 Palestinians were killed before this hospital? Why, all of a sudden he's choosing this 3-day mourning to be religious and use this as an excuse to sort of, insult Biden in America. And I think they're doing a disservice to the Palestinian people. I think it's going to backfire on them, and it's going to backfire on what America was trying to achieve in the region. And it shows only that we as Israelis and Jewish people are being misjudged and blamed with no proof. Like, for example, this whole hospital thing, everyone's backtracking today, but they're not making it the same news like they did yesterday, making it such a,
Well, I don't know about that. I think that the initial reactions are always going to have much, much greater impact than later recalibrations. I don't think you can ever do 12 hours later. Actually, it might not be quite as we reported 12 hours ago with the same impact, the same emotional heft as that initial response, that initial reaction. What happens, do you think, if it is very, very quickly established, big if, that Israel had absolutely nothing to do with the bombing of this hospital? Where does that leave Abbas and the King of Jordan and the President of Egypt?
There is no way that it was Israel. Israel had done that.
No, I know, but we can't say that yet. We can't say that.
No, of course, but if Israel has done that, they would not say that they did not do it, and they would not have shown all that evidence.
But if it is quickly established that they didn't, where does that lead the three leaders who have cancelled their meeting with Joe Biden today?
I think it leaves them in a worse position, because I think that Joe Biden is not Israel. He's the leader of, he's the president of America, and America gives aid to all these countries.
Yes.
And I think that if Israel did in fact do that, more the reason for them to sit down and meet with him and demand that he takes action against Israel, which they would have been in a stronger position to do that. I think they've weakened their position and they've weakened their argument by disrespecting Biden and by not sitting down with him. He's come there with an olive branch, reaching out to them to try and find a resolution to this Palestinian problem, and they're setting themselves backwards. Just like Hamas, I heard your previous caller who said, Hamas has advanced, and made an impact. I think they've taken the Palestinian struggle backwards, not forwards. I think they've done a disservice to Palestinians in the Palestinian Authority in West Bank and all around the world.
It's a really interesting point. Essentially, what you're saying, with obviously a strong belief that it had nothing to do with Israel, that what you're saying is, regardless of how this happened, it would have made the importance of Biden sitting down with these three leaders greater, not smaller.
Of course, you want to sit down. Of course, you want to sit. Do you agree with me? I mean, you want to sit down on both sides. If you think Israel has done this, why would you not sit down with the so-called leader of the free world, the president of the United States, who has the most power globally on everyone, and ask him to find a resolution rather than disrespecting America and setting yourself backwards in negotiations to make yourself, save face with,
if that's what it is. Yes. No, I hear you. I can't agree or disagree with you because I've only had like 14 seconds to contemplate the point that you've made. But I suspect that the response would be that Israel, if they had deliberately done this, have demonstrated complete contempt for any pursuit of peace, and therefore why should we be party to the pretense that is even possible? But that's a massive counterfactual that neither of us would be able to confirm or deny. Thank you, Ron. That was, again, another amazing call. That's incredibly helpful. But also bleak, of course, because even if we come to a much, much better understanding of everything that's going on or is likely to happen than we had at 10 o'clock this morning or 10 o'clock on Friday morning or 10 o'clock last Monday, none of it changes the horror of what continues to unfold.
James O'Brien on LBC.
4 minutes after 11, it is Wednesday, first PMQs in a while, and a debut, of course, in the analysis of it for our new political editor, Natasha Clark. That'll be with you at 12, or we'll be with you shortly before that, of course, to assess what is likely to come up. Private Eye, as ever, goes in hard this morning, the new issue of Private Eye magazine, which... I mean, goodness, things feel bad, don't they? Imagine how much worse they'd feel if it wasn't for the occasional demonstrations of journalistic probity and brilliance. So not only do they adjust their masthead this morning in the latest edition, which will have dropped through my letterbox in the last couple of hours. I'm lucky enough to have a subscription as a present last Christmas. So they've changed their masthead, so it says Private Eye for an Eye, which is just brilliant, isn't it? And chilling. But their front page today contains the following words. Usually they have a cartoon on their front page. It's very, very rare for them to do what I think they have done. I'm just going via their Twitter account, but this looks like it's the front cover. Warning in big yellow letters against a black background. This magazine may contain some criticism of the Israeli government and may suggest that killing everyone in Gaza as revenge for Hamas atrocities may not be a good long-term solution to the problems of the region, which crystallizes some of the thinking around this horrible and unfolding issue. The next bit, I think, thanks to the last call actually, and other contributions, thinking about the other angle of Joe Biden's trip to America. So we'll continue to ask about what success would look like for him and what you would like to see him achieve. But I do think actually the cancellation of the summit that was due to take place in Jordan later today, where Biden would have sat down with the Egyptian and Palestinian leaders to discuss Gaza, was cancelled yesterday after it emerged and was widely reported that Israel had bombed a hospital in Gaza. That I mean, it throws the entire trip into a form of disarray. But I'd like to know what you think about that, and we may need a slightly more Arab perspective than we've managed to get so far, if that's the correct word to use. Sarah makes an interesting point. She says it's worth being careful about looking at the Middle Eastern conflict through Western spectacles. Those in the Arab world, whether you like it or not, see this differently. It's like looking at the world atlas standing somewhere else. We don't know what conversations were had that led to this meeting being cancelled. So broadly, I just asked, what's the significance of the cancellation of this meeting? Because if it turns out, and at the moment the balance of probability suggests that it will turn out that Israel didn't do this, cancelling an important meeting with the President of the United States of America upon the understanding that they did begins to look pretty hairy, doesn't it? Pretty scary, in fact. So what is the significance of this cancellation? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. It is 7 minutes after 11. And we go again. Charmaine is in Epsom. Charmaine, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Thanks for taking my call. I think the cancellation, first of all, I think people need to know that last night in Ramallah there was a lot of protesting and anger from Palestinians towards the Palestinian president.
For planning to go?
No, for basically not doing anything about the way they're treated generally by the IDF and how they've been living for the last how many years, and of course about what's been happening and the casualties in Gaza. The protest was, they showed it on TV. I was watching Al Jazeera last night, and then the president came on and said, after the hospital had been bombed, he came on and said, I'm going to go to Gaza because I need to be with the people who are suffering.
So possibly a form of... Well, you tell me, so I shouldn't have interrupted you.
Well, no, it's just more he's trying to save himself because they're really angry with him. I mean, obviously, being angry with Israel isn't going to achieve anything because, Israel are too powerful for the Palestinians to have any effect. I'm talking about the masses and the common Palestinian person. So he's really saving his own neck and coming back. And he does probably feel a lot of distress about all the deaths. So I don't think your last caller was saying, this is a, kick in the teeth or whatever, disrespectful to Biden. I don't think that's the primary objective for him to diss Biden.
But I don't know that he was suggesting that. He was just suggesting that will be a consequence of the decision, not the reason for the decision, as you've just, I think, rather brilliantly explained. But it will probably be a consequence of this. It does make Biden look a bit silly, doesn't it?
Well, yes, but the thing is, Biden has unequivocally said he's going to support Israel and the actions of Israel.
He hasn't said he'd support every single thing they do.
Not in the last couple of days.
No.
But I just think, somebody else made the point why Palestinians aren't. They need to denounce Hamas. They're just trying to survive. They're trying to not get killed at the moment. This is not the time for them to denounce us, but they're just trying to not be bombed.
You don't go any further than saying to stay alive. And to stay alive, you have to run away from your home and everything you own and cross your fingers and hope for the best and pray that wherever the bombs and the missiles have been launched, just pray that none of them land on you. So... But
also, sorry, James, I was going to say what Joe Biden should be doing is calling a ceasefire.
Yeah.
And the fact that he hasn't is disappointing for everybody, for Americans, I think, as well. I don't know if they realize how much of their tax-paying dollars are being used to help Israel. I mean, they know, but I don't know what they think. Joe Biden's saying that Americans are with you as well. I don't think that's true either. I think a lot of the population are really quite distressed by how many deaths there have been.
If he called for a ceasefire, the immediate response would be to point out that leaves the perpetrators of the atrocity in southern Israel last week at large.
But how far are they going to keep going? What is their number? Are they going to go for about a million?
I can't answer that question. No one that's called me. No one that's called me can answer that question. Or no one is prepared to, because if you believe that there is no price too high in Palestinian blood to avenge the murder of Israelis or to excise Hamas from the world stage, you're highly unlikely to say it out loud. Certainly people aren't going to say it to me on this program. I don't know what the figure is. I think one life is worth one life, so I might agree with the calls for a ceasefire, but I'm reminding you what would happen if he did. It would be pointed out correctly that this leaves the people responsible for the atrocity in southern Israel free and unpunished.
Yeah, and I think going back to the hospital and the bombing, I think it's you can't blame people for saying straight away it was Israel, because they have killed 1,000 children. Let's be real here, and there hasn't been much condemnation
I disagree.
from anybody about that.
I disagree with you. You absolutely can condemn the killing of 1,000 children. You can point out, but it doesn't give you any. It gives you an excuse, Charmaine, but it doesn't give you permission to spread misinformation. really dangerous misinformation that insults, potentially insults the dead.
But also, the IDF have bombed hospitals in the past. They've done it in 2014, and they've done it recently as well. And they also the same thing happened with the Palestinian journalist Shireen Abu Akleh.
No, that's true. No, that's true.
They denied it, and then it turned out to be they were lying.
Yeah, but you're telling me now you can never trust a word that the Israelis say. That's your point.
But given
it is what you're saying. You're saying you can't blame anyone. You can't blame anyone for claiming that the Israelis blew up the hospital, even though they denied it was them, because you can't trust a word that they say. And in that world, there's no point in us even talking to each other.
No, but James, the thing is they are the ones who are conducting the airstrikes, and given the past performance of the last 10 days, it's not that.
No, here's the distinction.
It's not that unbelievable.
No, well, that's the distinction that I think you're missing with respect. That you can make a very strong argument for why people believed that Israel had done this, but you cannot make a strong argument for people reporting that Israel had done this. That's one of the most central tenets of journalism, and indeed public responsibility.
And we should wait for that.
Yes,
but
exactly.
I'm just wondering who's going to investigate that. I mean, are they going to be doing their own homework on this? I mean, who is going to investigate this, and who are we going to believe?
Well, would it be rude of me to suggest that you've already decided what you're going to believe, regardless of who investigates what?
But the reason why I don't believe it is because the IDF spokesperson, is it Hanania Naftali, tweeted and then he deleted it. So when he tweeted that Israel has bombed this hospital because we believe that Hamas is storing missiles or whatever, and it's a tragedy that Hamas has made us do this. Basically,
I haven't seen that.
I mean, he did tweet that. It's all over Twitter, and he's actually tweeted.
No, I've seen the bit about the video being removed from a tweet, and that adding some confusion or doubt to the original claim. But I've also seen counterclaim and counterclaim. So I need to find the official Israeli Defense Force taking responsibility for the attack. Is that what you're telling me?
Yeah, and also the UN, the Palestinian ambassador to the UN spoke about it this morning as well, when he was asked about the bombing and why was Israel behind it.
And that would render that would render everything that's emerged subsequent. I mean, what does that do to Joe Biden's visit? Because you're in direct contrast to my previous caller before the news, who made a very strong case for it being relatively ridiculous to believe that Israel would have done this deliberately. You make the opposite case, so I'll ask you the same question. What does it do to Joe Biden? Where does it leave Joe Biden?
Well, Joe Biden, as I said before, has to acknowledge the humanitarian crisis. He has to help with creating a corridor for aid. He can still stand with Israel because he always will, according to Netanyahu. He will, and he said he will. Fine. Have solidarity with Israel, but what about the humanitarian crisis? What about the people who have died? He's not really acknowledging that, and I think he needs to if he wants to gain favour with the international community.
And that would involve a de-escalation. That would involve for him success will be fewer Palestinians dying in the coming days than would have died otherwise. And I don't know how you measure that. I don't disagree with you, and I hope he somehow achieves it. But I wonder how you measure that. Thank you, Charmaine. I'm not fully across one of the things that you referred to. I'm struggling to find it, but I will endeavour to do so. 16 minutes after 11 is the time.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
19 minutes after 11 is the time, and just for the avoidance of confusion, I found the tweet that Charmaine referred to, and no criticism whatsoever of her, but this character who tweeted that Israel had bombed the hospital as breaking news and subsequently deleted it is a social media influencer. And certainly not speaking officially on behalf of the Israeli Defense Force, which is what confused me. And then he seems to have spent subsequent hours reverse ferreting and apologising on Twitter. So that was not what many people, dare I say, wanted it to be, or perhaps it's a little kinder to say believed it to be. Hassan is in Leeds. Hassan, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Good morning. Hope you're well. So just on the subject of, was it Biden's visit to Israel you were asking about in the beginning? your show today. I think beyond the rhetorical support, of course, that Biden has to pledge and double down on giving to Israel, I think the purpose of the visit, and this might sound quite strange, actually has less to do with the particularities of Israel-Palestine and maybe more to do with other global crises that are taking place.
I don't think that sounds strange. I mean, in the sense that he is very keen to stop the conflict going global. I think it's a profoundly unstrange thing to say.
Yeah. So my thinking on that basis is that Biden will be telling Israel to try and mitigate the potential of this conflict spiraling out of control. And I guess the last thing the United States wants is for this conflict to manifest in an all-out regional conflict. And for especially they're particularly wary of Iran getting involved in a significant capacity because they don't want global oil supplies coming to a halt because Iran has the potential to close off the Strait of Hormuz. And the last thing that Biden wants back at home is, of course, anything that can make inflation surge once again. So there are a lot of domestic considerations, I believe, on the US's part for why they will be, maybe in a private capacity telling Israel, really, we need to rein this in now. I mean, the fact that we've still, we've been hearing these conversations now about an impending ground invasion, but, we've still not happened yet, which is rather telling in itself.
Why do you think that's rather telling in itself? Because you think there's a prospect of it not happening?
Yeah, I mean, there is. I think it's more... on my part, I think the calculus was initially, following October the 7th, I think Israel really, I think part of their strategic calculus was to do a ground invasion and kind of root out Hamas once and for all. But I think the US, with their domestic and global considerations, would have probably thought on a more macro level and thought, wait a minute, we can't afford to let Iran and Hezbollah, and something that's not mentioned, because I watch Arab media a lot, and I mean, as a lecturer on the Middle East, is that even Iraq's militias that were instrumental in rooting out ISIS have pledged support to the what they call Lebanese resistance. So I think behind the scenes, Israel really doesn't have any idea of the kind of the sheer amount of support, quote unquote, on the other side, and how much backing Hamas actually has should a ground invasion occur, which I think the United States is very apprehensive about taking place.
So I mean, really, the only purpose of Biden's visit in the context of avoiding global escalation or wider escalation would be a measurable diminishment in the offensive in Gaza. But how can you measure an unknown? I sound like Donald Rumsfeld now, Hassan.
Yeah, all the what we know and what we don't know.
Yeah. All of that.
That one, yeah. I mean, it is hard to measure. The truth is that they are trying to analyze, like you said, it's an unknown situation right now. I do feel that the United States is trying to play a balancing act.
For sure.
trying to give Israel the kind of the license to go ahead with its offensive in some remit, but I do feel this aspect of a ground invasion, not only because it'll suck Israeli troops and even probably some of their reservists into bogged down war. This could end up becoming, quote unquote, Israel's Vietnam, just as Saudi Arabia got bogged down in a war with Yemen, which they thought they'd finish in a couple of weeks, with a militia that's even less powerful than, quote unquote, Hamas and Hezbollah, which are much more equipped.
Especially Hezbollah. How? I mean, this. I don't know how stupid this question is, really. But what is the best thing that could happen this week with regard to Biden, regard to Joe Biden being in the Middle East? The thing that you would hear reported on a news bulletin, and you'd go, yeah, thank goodness for that.
Yeah, I mean, are you talking from a US-centric perspective?
No, I'm talking from a Hassan in Leeds perspective.
From my perspective, I think, I mean, maybe this sounds like I'm personally a non-interventionist, and I feel the best thing the United States can do is try have as less of a military foothold in the Middle East as it can. That's probably the best way it can garner support for his cause. And that links to your point about the significance of the other Arab states cancelling. with because you wanted to get, I think you asked something about, you wanted to kind of get kind of like the Arab-centric perspective on all this. In short, the Arab states are very wary of domestic uprisings. I think what's lost on a lot of people in the West is that these Arab states, as part of their kind of maintaining their legitimacy, you got to remember they're non-democracies.
Yeah, of course. I mean,
they have to pay lip service in terms of rhetorical support in some capacity for the Palestinian cause. So if they're seen shaking hands with the United States at this time in particular,
right?
Yeah, the optics aren't good, let's put it that way.
And that's, I think, the point that my earlier texter was making about the dangers of looking at this from a very very Western perspective, is that you forget about, not least the caller who explained what was happening in Ramallah, and how Abbas's decision not to go might have had as much to do with protecting his own position at home as it did with anything geopolitical or international. And as you've reminded us, these are considerations that everyone... I mean, look, I suppose, if I've understood you correctly, you're reminding us of the Arab Spring and how fragile a lot of these regimes are.
Exactly. That's what they're really terrified of. These countries are trying to redevelop. They're part of this South-South global development, which, of course, China's behind massively. Yeah. And the last thing they want to happen is Arab Spring 2.0, as you've rightly alluded to. So one thing they can do, and this is precisely why we've had the Saudi Arabia on ice right now, who've literally pulled back from the precipice of signing a normalization deal, which is one of the principal aims as to why Hamas did October the 7th in particular, because they knew if Saudi Arabia normalizes relations with Israel, what are we going to have? They know that symbolically that is effectively a large part of the Arab and broader Muslim world having to acknowledge Israel as a reality, and that's the last thing Hamas wanted. So that was definitely one of the ideas. And what we had more recently, not mentioned in Western media, is that Saudi Arabia is talking a hell of a lot more to Iran. Let's put it that way.
I always bridle slightly when people... Bridle's not the right word, certainly not with you, but when people say it's not being reported in Western media, you need to tell me a bit more now about where it is being reported and why that's so significant.
No, I mean, obviously you can... I mean, if you did a cursory search of those specific topics online, you will get media sources, but I'm just saying it's not in the forefront of...
No, okay, fair enough. You're not alleging conspiracy or anything like that.
No, nothing.
It's just not. There's not the bandwidth. There's not the bandwidth.
What's more newsworthy than others? The point that I've mentioned about Biden doesn't want Iran to get dragged into this because global oil supplies can get affected is hardly on people's radar when thinking about the atrocity. Yesterday, the horrific scenes we saw with the hospital. That's obviously more. That's going to capture people's attention much more. But that doesn't take away from, that being part of, I believe, Biden's considerations of the United States right now. The last thing they want is more broadly, the truth is that the United States, since the Obama administration, view the Middle East as a distraction.
Yeah.
Ever since Barack Obama came into office, he said, I don't know if you remember the phrase pivot to Asia. That pivot to Asia was symbolic of the United States saying that we've exhausted our efforts. We know that, the global war and the quote-unquote war on terror has ultimately failed to meet U.S. objectives in a whole host of ways.
Yeah.
And this is, I mean, that should be really a lesson for Israel right now. We had 20 years proof of, knee-jerk reactions following 9/11. And what did we get at the end of it? We got a dysfunctional state in the form of Iraq, which is by default in the hands of Iran, effectively, and the Taliban are back in power in Afghanistan. So
that's the other mad thing about the earliest days, was when people started talking about it being Israel's September the 11th, as if that justified the apocalyptic response that was feared and still is feared. As if no one actually paid any attention to what the apocalyptic response to September the 11th had done to the world.
Well, this is the irony. Even if you were going to take an Israeli security standpoint, talking in this post 9/11 discourse and war on terror, it didn't do the United States any favors.
No, so
and Israel is seen as, you got to understand, Israel's seen with even more scorn given the history of the conflict with the Palestinian people. So in what world, I guess my point is that in what world is their strategy But, the fact of the matter is they've been occupying these people now since for the last 18 years since they, quote-unquote, pulled down. In what world do they think that they are ever going to be able to, quote-unquote, root out Hamas? And even if Hamas was militarily taken out, you don't think the children of those Palestinians... I think
this is exactly
This is the cyclical aspect of it, isn't it?
Of course it is. Of course. Where do you teach? Do you mind me asking?
Oh, so I used to be a lecturer in King's, SOAS, Leeds, and now I just work in a consultancy remit. I'm actually helping Channel 4 with some fact checking at the minute. So,
well, thank you for finding the time to.
Right now.
Well, thank you for finding the time to help us with some fact checking as well, Hassan. Thank you, and of course broader analysis as well. I know I keep saying this, but it is extraordinary the quality of calls we get now on topics like this. It's a testament to something. I'm not quite sure what. The time now is 11:31.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
25 minutes to 12 is the time. And I mean, it's odd, isn't it, that we started... I'm not going to get too distracted by this, but clarity is important. I started off this morning talking about how sad it was that you can't rely on Twitter because of the corruption of its verification system by Elon Musk to identify sources that are credible. No one's ever infallible, but sources that are credible as opposed to sources that are clearly not credible. Anybody can buy a blue tick. And this social media influencer who also does some work in the digital department of the Israeli government, that's the claim, I think, that is true. But he's also got his own Patreon account on his Twitter page looking for donations and passing the hat around. So he is absolutely and categorically not an official government spokesman, or even, I would argue, given that he posted that Israel had attacked this hospital and then very quickly deleted it, he's also clearly not a credible source with a bought blue tick. But, and this is the point that Sam makes so well. Everyone's now fixated on who is to blame for yesterday's hospital attack. Surely it's time to think about the horrific loss of life and those suffering. I agree with you, but the argument will rage about who was responsible for the attack forever now, because even if it is conclusively proved that it was X as opposed to Y will claim that X has influenced the investigation, or that Y can't be trusted to conduct an investigation at all. So you're back to the importance of supranational scrutiny, organisations that transcend any loyalty, whether it's tribal or otherwise. But you cannot argue with a straight face that someone who describes himself as a media personality and has a cap, passing his cap around on social media with a paid-for blue tick, would have been speaking officially for the Israeli government last night, deliberately revealing that they'd bombed a hospital and then deleting it. It doesn't fit any narrative, however warped it may be. But of course, a million people or a bazillion people claim that it fits whatever narrative it is that they want it to fit. And just to add even more. Oh, I can't add any more confusion to the conversation as it's unfolding. Good morning, James, writes Richard. I am increasingly impressed and amazed at the intelligence, rhetoric and knowledge of the majority of your callers. You're very kind, and then you say some nice things about me, but there's been far too much of that lately. 11:38 is the time. Back to this question and back to the purpose of Joe Biden's visit. I have a much better understanding now of both the significance and probably the cause of the cancellation of the mooted visit with, the scheduled visit with Middle Eastern leaders that has been cancelled, the summit in Jordan where Egyptian and Palestinian and Jordanian leaders were due to sit down with Joe Biden. I think you've got to remember the Arab Spring to understand the plates that Arab leaders have spinning at any given time, and one imagines that solidarity with the people of Gaza as a given, possibly with Hamas as well, runs a lot deeper in the countries that we're talking about than most of us here perhaps acknowledge. And that is why they have to make decisions based upon where they are and what is good for them rather than what is good for peace or Joe Biden or even Gaza. 11:39 is the time. Carlo is in Broxbourne. Carlo, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Good morning. Thank you. I'm a first-time caller, so apologies if I sound a bit nervous.
Don't. Well, you don't. You don't so far, so carry on.
Thank you. So I think the purpose of Joe Biden's visit was obviously de-escalation. I think probably the main objective he had when going over, obviously I can't read his mind, but I think the main thing he wanted to do was kind of maybe secure the transfer of hostages from Gaza back to Israel. I think this because I think within Israel itself, Netanyahu's been criticised a lot for his failure to do this. And
his failure to get the hostages out.
Yes.
Well, he hasn't even tried. I mean, the bulk of the commentary I've read is enormous complaints from the families of the hostages about the absolute absence of any effort to rescue them, but also probably the impossibility. It sounds, you may be right about Biden, I'm not sure, but it sounded a little bit bogus to me this week when people have said the reason why all of these Palestinians have to die is because we've got to rescue our hostages.
Yeah, and then it's not like, I mean, I'm a history graduate and I kind of studied this at university. So in terms of the historical context of this, there's been prisoner swaps before.
Yes.
You know, in terms of swapping hostages, Israeli hostages in Gaza for maybe Hamas prisoners that were in prison in Israel.
You can't do that if your avowed intent is to eradicate Hamas.
Well, exactly. And I think Biden went over with, the intention to kind of maybe, extend an arm out, give his own advice to Netanyahu and just say, look, if you can't carry on with this kind of
but that's the problem, isn't it? That's the real problem here for Biden, is that success means that Israel will moderate its actions, I think, on the international stage. On the domestic American stage, I'm not sure that's true. But whether it is or not, I don't know how you measure it. So I forget. I think the death toll is over 3,000 now. So what? So the mooted land invasion doesn't happen. That looks like a diplomatic victory for Joe Biden, but it's politically very dangerous for Benjamin Netanyahu. I can't see, apart from your point about hostages, which I don't know. I don't think I agree with it. I don't think it's as big a deal as you're portraying it as. But who knows? That's not a criticism. Apart from the hostages, I don't know what success could be sold as or even look like.
Well, I think you're touching on a point there, James, where you're saying that moderation for Netanyahu would be a failure.
Well, I think domestically that there is an appetite for some very, very serious retaliation in Gaza. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Just like we had in the UK and the US after 9/11 and 7/7. The Israeli people are feeling very angry. They want revenge. But I think the international community now is overwhelmingly calling for moderation, for allowing these humanitarian passages into Gaza to allow people to have electricity, water and food. And I think that's the right thing. And I think going down the path of revenge is only going to escalate things further. Yeah. And I also think that this is actually, what's happened overnight is actually quite a big turning point in this conflict. I think the fact that these meetings have been cancelled with Biden from the Arab leaders is only going to escalate things further. I think that we're going to see now we're already seeing the war for the narrative, and I think that's what's happened overnight. Yeah,
and that doesn't for that analysis, the ultimate responsibility for the tragedy at the hospital doesn't actually matter, does it?
No.
And that's the really scary thing, in a way.
Yeah.
That's all anyone is talking about at the moment, except us, thankfully. But the actual answer to that question when it comes, first of all, lots of people won't believe it, whatever it is, and second of all, it doesn't change the scenario for the Arab leaders who aren't going to sit down with Joe Biden anymore. That's done. That ship has sailed now.
Yeah. And I'm worried that we've been down this path a lot of times before between Israel and Gaza.
Yes.
But we've always come to some kind of conclusion.
But it's never a conclusion, Carlo, is it? It's always it's always a stopgap. And that's probably what we're looking at again. You can talk all you want about eradicating Hamas, but nobody, and I don't want to say sensible, because I want to say no one who is not heavily emotionally invested believes that it's possible, for the very simple reason that even if you kill them all, there's new generations coming up with grievances. You describe them as a grievance or a radicalisation. Again, it depends on your perspective. It's not going to happen as long as the blockade is in place, as long as there's no Palestinian state, then the grievance will remain in place. So what Netanyahu's trying to do is buy another 10 years, buy another 20 years of suppression before it grows up again.
Yeah, and I think we're going to go into new territory now. I think the US has kind of stepped in. It's told Israel to calm things down. Make sure
all
that
hinges on that, doesn't it? And again, we can't measure what calming things down looks like because we don't know what would have happened if the calming down hadn't been put in place. Flipping it. Thank you, Carlo. Lovely debut. And just by in the spirit of calming things down, just to close down finally this. Twitter controversy that Sharmina brought to our attention, the social media influencer who may have been or has been reported to have been helping Benjamin Netanyahu's party with their digital presence, like a sort of online advisor, although, as I said to you, he's still seeking payment on his social media account. It was reported on his own account a couple of weeks ago that he'd been drafted to serve in the army and that his account was now going to be run by his wife. So that's what this entire Twitter firestorm thrown up by people who profess to be credible and trustworthy, that's what it's all based on. A Twitter account by an Israeli social media influencer, currently being run by his wife, posted that Israel had attacked a hospital and then deleted it. And that is proof, apparently. Proof of what? I'm not entirely sure, but it's definitely conclusive proof of whatever these people want it to be conclusive proof of.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
10 minutes to 12 is the time. Why do we do this? You know why we do this, but occasionally we need reminders. And thanks to Tony in Bishop Stortford for providing one. James, I just wanted to say that last night my two teenage daughters asked me to explain what was going on in this situation. Now, I'm not the sharpest tool in the box, but based on what I've heard from your callers, I was able to explain what was going on pretty well, even if I do say so myself. And that's a compliment I thought I would pass on to the people responsible for providing Tony with the knowledge and the understanding that he needed. PMQ's on the way, but we will take one or two more calls on this, the broader question of the Middle East crisis, another Middle East crisis, but the specific question of what Joe Biden is doing, should be doing, will be doing, isn't doing. Pick as you please. Peter's in Eastbourne. Peter, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello.
Yeah, really nice to speak to you.
Well, you don't know that yet. It's only just started. Go on.
I think it will be.
I hope so.
Anyway, I think there's a lot to be gained in domestic politics for Joe Biden in this. Donald Trump's first reaction was to come down and criticise Netanyahu.
And also say quite complimentary things about Hezbollah, I think.
Yeah.
Not Hamas, but Hezbollah. Hey-ho, who can make sense of what's going on in that strange orange environment?
No, but I mean, I think that what he'd done was he anticipated that Netanyahu was going to come under massive criticism, get the blame for everything, which is possibly true. But I think the way Biden went about it was much better. He established that Israel is their greatest alliance in the region and that they're very, very important and he adores them. And I think that they really took the Trump thing as criticism of Israel and their policy, and they were quite hurt by it, and very hurt by it. Now, if you look at Rory Stewart did a fantastic The Rest Is Politics last week, where he had a
Come on here and start plugging the opposition. What do you do for a living? What do you do for a living?
I'm a retired psychiatric nurse.
Well, how would you feel? Well, I don't know if this is going to work, really, but how would you feel if I started bigging up your biggest rival as a psychiatric nurse? That doesn't work, does it?
What, you mean adult social care?
No, I mean, like, you've got an enemy, you've got a nemesis from when you were training. And I'm now saying they're the best psychiatric nurse in Eastbourne. I was hoping you were going to say something like a plumber, and then I could have talked about how the best plumber in Eastbourne isn't you. But anyway, don't come on and praise too unduly some people who are perceived as our rivals. Carry on, Peter.
I reckon you could probably work together.
I reckon you're right.
Anyway.
Yeah.
So anyway, I think that Biden there's a process that I can envisage, certainly, where he goes to Israel, and I think that what Rory Stewart exposed was that, or the guy on his programme exposed, was that Biden is the most politically representative view of the Israeli people. So this is, this is heaven made for him, really. This is kind of him going out to get adulation.
And I see what you mean. And the cancellation of the meeting with the Arab leaders, doesn't that throw a bit of a spanner in the works?
Well, a little bit, but it's very, very raw, and it's early days yet.
Yeah.
I mean, I can see a pathway here. I think that what has to happen now is all of the Arab constituents, they have to start becoming political and not militant, and first thing they have to do is accept and agree with Israel's right to exist.
Yeah, that's the.
And I think then there has to be
first step to a two-state solution, isn't it? It has to be the first step to the two-state solution is for the people who seek one of the states to acknowledge the right of the other state to exist. And you know that people listening will see it from the other side and think that the demonstration of an appetite for a two-state solution needs to come from Israel which is unlikely to happen under the current administration, before you can realistically expect the other side to move towards that kind of resolution. But you're right otherwise. Thank you, Peter. Last call on this, I think, to Becky in Kenilworth. Becky, you'll have to be slightly brief because we're about to start anticipating PMQs. What would you like to say?
Yeah, no worries. I'll be as quick as I can.
Well, you don't have to be as quick as you can, but just moderately brief, please. Okay.
Yeah, so the first thing I would hope out of this visit is for Joe Biden to clarify for the future what standing with Israel means.
Yeah.
Because standing with Israel in terms of its right to exist is very different from, giving carte blanche to whatever Netanyahu wants to do. Point. And he can see his kind of own fumbling political power. His own people are angry with him, and all of that. He might not come out of this as successfully as he wants to. Second point quickly on the blast. I will admit I was very quick to look at all the information coming out last night, particularly with that digital media influencer who's been appointed by Netanyahu.
Yeah.
So I think just because I'd been so consumed and so quickly swiping through stuff, I should have taken a step back on that.
Yes.
What I would say is,
we've all been there. We've all been guilty of that.
Yeah, what I would say on the question of the blast itself is, do Hamas have the kind of artillery to inflict that level of destruction? Looking at Israel's past, strikes on hospitals and things like that. And also, I would hope that the investigation is done by an outside party, because Israel does have a history of, saying it hasn't done something, quietly admitting months later when the world has moved on.
Yes, no, I think you're allowed to say that, but the evidence will be fairly incontrovertible, and when it is finally examined and when it finally emerges. But I don't really want to go down that rabbit hole, and we haven't been having a phone in about who do you trust on the question of what happened last night, for reasons that are fairly obvious in that nobody knows, so everything is an opinion. And as you acknowledge, yours was quite easily swayed by a fairly ridiculous source. So very briefly, what just in your own mind, why would somebody acting on behalf of the Israeli government announce that they'd bombed a hospital and then delete it? What would be the master plan there?
I think maybe it was as part of the kind of seeing what public opinion would be on that kind of thing.
You don't know. That's silly. You know what public opinion would be on an army bombing a hospital. So this is the thing about conspiracy theories that always intrigues me. What do you think the plan was? Because you believed for a while that as someone representing the Israeli government, even though they only bought their blue tick last month, but you can be forgiven for not checking that, he deliberately announced that Israel had bombed a hospital on behalf of the official government of Israel and then deleted it a few minutes later. What was the master plan, do you think, that you fell for?
I think I saw a deleted screenshot of that after I'd seen the bombing itself.
Yeah. So what was the master plan by tweeting it and then deleting it from the position of being a member of the Israeli government, which of course he wasn't?
I honestly don't know whether
that's the question you've got to ask yourself before you decide that it's persuasive or in any way worth contemplating or considering. You've got to ask yourself what the master plan is.
Considering the amount of bombing that had happened this past week, but
we're not talking about that, though. We're talking about a completely unreliable source that you chose to believe, but without really stopping to think about what it was you were choosing to believe.
He wasn't the. It was kind of confirmation. It was kind of confirmation bias.
Yes, that's very honest of you.
After seeing the amount of posts that are coming out.
But again, it's not. I mean, again, you're not addressing the central question, which is that there is no logical explanation of why, even if he was who you believed he was, which he wasn't, he would have done the thing that you think he did. And it wasn't even him, of course, as it's turned out subsequently. It was his wife. On an account that bought a blue tick last month. But there you go. That is the nature of the line, if you like, between misinformation and disinformation. It's misinformation when you fall for it. It's disinformation when you continue to disseminate it despite knowing that it's not true. Natasha Clark, our recently appointed political editor, is with us to cast an eye over what is likely to happen in the imminent PMQs. It's the first for a while, and I don't envy you, actually, because there are quite a lot of roads that Keir Starmer could choose to go down.
I think that what he will do is just choose to reflect, as he did on Monday's debate in the Commons, in that sort of, I'm Keir Starmer, I want to be Prime Minister, I need to try and persuade people that I could be Prime Minister, I could be statesman-like, I can handle this obviously very sensitive discussion in the Middle East. And I think he will go and ask Rishi Sunak some of the more details that we're looking for. What's the Prime Minister doing to get that aid into Gaza? How are you working to get that aid?
Do you think it will crossing? Be all about Gaza?
I think he can't not, especially with what happened last night. He can't start at least with it. How many hostages are there? What is the UK government doing to try and get them out? And also, will he visit? The Prime Minister's office haven't confirmed those reports that the Prime Minister may visit Israel later this week. And obviously, what does that mean for the growing terror risk here in the UK as well? And obviously he could go on. There are a few other topics I guess he could go on. We've obviously had the prisons announcement from Alex Chalk on Monday, which is pretty big.
And more today about prisoners being moved into open prisons without necessarily the right assessment you'd expect. Prisoners being released early so that we can make room for more prisoners, which might include people being jailed for 13 years for knocking out nitrous oxide.
Exactly, and the government's obviously brought forward their plans today to ban laughing gas and when it will come in. And, I think this all can go into and inflation. That's another one on my list. The Tory mortgage premium, I think Keir Starmer loves talking about that, and also shoplifting. That fits into the prisons and crime sort of crackdown. And Labour talked a lot about shoplifting at their conference. And how does that fit with when the Tories are letting people out of prison early and banning sentences of under 12 months? How does that fit with the shoplifting crackdown? And I think Labour are going to try and make crime a really big part of their campaign of the election when we eventually do see it, and they're going to be able to legitimately accuse the Conservatives of being a bit soft on this issue.
Indeed. So it is going to be a very sensitive one. Would you expect to see a little less ad hominem than we've got used to in recent exchanges because of the sober nature of the global picture?
Yeah, definitely. And we saw that on Monday in the Commons between Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer. Both of them were quite sombre in their attitudes and their comments, and both urged both sides to sort of tone down the rhetoric, tone down the sort of inflammatory comments, and to give respect to people on both sides. And I think I would expect to just see a repeat of that, essentially, of that calm nature.
Although Sunak's not shy of bringing the last, even though he's no longer a member of the Parliamentary Labour Party, if he were seeking to score some points in ways that he has in the past, Sunak, in case of emergency, break glass and bring out Jeremy Corbyn.
He could do that. I don't think he will.
I don't think he will.
I think he's been very clear all week. Not yet. And I don't think we're in the situation where everything is all so heightened at the moment. And we had a couple of MPs on Monday try and sort of raise that debate and try and accuse, the Israel government of war crimes and such. And I think they were sort of shouted down a little bit in the chamber, shall we say.
Yes, they were. That said, though, very few people casting votes tomorrow in key by-elections are going to be casting votes according to what either party leader is doing vis-à-vis Israel and Gaza.
Yeah, it's probably not going to be something that's in forefront of voters' minds, and I think probably Sir Keir Starmer or Rishi Sunak will probably note the by-election tomorrow and note voters going to the polls if they start to talk about domestic issues. If it stays on Israel-Gaza, then I don't see that sort of being a thing, because like you said, it's just not something that's in the forefront of voters' minds when they're voting tomorrow in those key by-elections in Tamworth and Mid-Bedfordshire for those two MPs that have been a bit naughty.
Are you confident as you approach your first by-elections as LBC's political editor that you're completely au fait with Ofcom rules and regulations on election days?
Yeah, I've just been reading them up.
Have you?
All 156 I've just been doing my training.
You've done it all 156
I haven't read every single page yet, but I've done my adequate training has already been partaken. I'm very confident.
Yes, it is a tightrope, but it's quite a fat tightrope that you'll have to walk. I fell off it once many years ago on the day of a by-election, so I tend to err on the side of caution, but we look forward to hearing you get stuck into that. We've reached the point in proceedings where I reserve the right to cross abruptly to the House of Commons as soon as Sir Keir Starmer gets to his feet. I imagine that there will be expressions of condolence and regret for events in Gaza overnight, so don't expect the usual braying and guffawing from the backbenches. And then, as Natasha has just explained, you would expect the first question, or possibly all of them, to return to that sort of territory. I don't know, is the short answer. I wouldn't be shocked or particularly dismayed if Keir Starmer did elect to bring in some domestic political issues as well, given that, Natasha, the Tories are really up against it at the moment, on almost every front.
Yeah, we've just had the Tories are just cheering the SNP's Lisa Cameron. She's crossed the floor to join them.
Yes.
So that'll give them their cheers and jeers to sort of gee them up ready.
And here we go.
Here
it comes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I start by warmly welcoming the new member for Rutherglen and Hamilton West? Mr. Speaker, the news last night of hundreds killed at the Baptist Hospital in Gaza is incredibly distressing. But it's much worse for the people of Gaza. Their fear that there's no place of safety is profound. International law must be upheld, and that means hospitals and civilian lives must be protected. Last night, the Foreign Secretary said the UK will work with our allies to find out what has happened. I know this only happened last night, but can the Prime Minister please tell us when he thinks he might be able to update the House on progress with that work?
I know the whole House will have been shocked by the scenes at Al Ali Hospital. Any loss of innocent life is a dreadful tragedy, and everyone will be thinking both of those who have lost their lives and the families that they leave behind. We should not rush to judgment before we have all the facts on this awful situation. Every member will know that the words we say here have an impact beyond this House. This morning I met with the National Security Advisor, but also the chair of the Joint Intelligence Committee. I can tell the honourable gentleman our intelligence services have been rapidly analysing the evidence to independently establish the facts. We are not in a position at this point to say more than that, but I can tell him we are working at pace, but also cooperating and collaborating with our allies on this issue as we look to get to the bottom of the situation, and we will also continue all our efforts to get humanitarian aid into the region.
You're stumped. I thank the Prime Minister for his answer. The terrible news last night came as we are still mourning the terrorist attack on Israel last week. Jews taken hostage, mutilated, slaughtered. And yesterday I met the families of some of the British hostages held by Hamas. Every minute of every hour of every day, they hope for good news, but fear the worst. They know the lives of their loved ones are in the hands of murderers. It's unimaginable agony. Israel has a right, a duty, to defend itself from Hamas, keep its people safe, and bring hostages home. But isn't it clear that if Hamas had a single concern for human life, a single concern for the safety of the Palestinian people, then they would never have taken these hostages, and they should release them immediately.
Well, Mr. Speaker, it is important consistently for us to remember that Israel has suffered a shockingly brutal terrorist attack, and it is Hamas and Hamas alone that is responsible for this conflict. Our thoughts are rightly with those who have been taken hostage and their families. The distress they are feeling will be unimaginable for all those affected. I will be meeting with some of the families and offering them all the support of the British government to get their relatives home. We are working around the clock with our partners and allies to secure their freedom, And importantly, in amongst my other regional calls, I spoke specifically with the Emir of Qatar yesterday on this very issue, which we discussed at length. The Qatari government is taking a lead and working intensely to help release hostages using their contacts in the region, and we are working very closely with them to ensure the safe return of the British hostages.
Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, I also met charities with staff working in Gaza and heard their accounts of the harrowing humanitarian crisis. Children fleeing their homes, hospitals barely able to function. The lights are going out, and the innocent civilians of Gaza are terrified that they will die in the darkness, out of sight. International law must always be followed. Hamas are not the Palestinian people, and the Palestinian people are not Hamas. Does he agree that medicines, food, fuel and water must get into Gaza immediately? This is an urgent situation, and innocent Palestinians need to know that the world is not just simply watching, but acting to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe.
Mr. Speaker, as I said on Monday, an acute humanitarian crisis is unfolding to which we must respond. It is right that we support the Palestinian people because they are victims of Hamas too. And that is why we have provided a further £10 million in humanitarian aid for people in the region. And we are working through preemptively moving aid and relief teams to Egypt, specifically to the El Arish airfield. We are working with local partners like the Egyptian Red Crescent and the United Nations primarily, and deploying Navy assets to the region, as well as exploring how we can support logistical requirements. And I've also raised this issue of humanitarian access in all of my conversations as a priority with every leader in the region, and we will continue working with them to get aid to where it is needed as quickly as possible.
Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As has already been alluded to, since Hamas's terrorist attack, our country has seen a disgusting rise in anti-Semitism. Jewish businesses attacked, Jewish schools marked with red paint, and Jewish families hiding who they are. And we've seen an appalling surge in Islamophobia, racist graffiti, mosques forced to ramp up security, British Muslims and Palestinians spoken to as if they were terrorists. Does he agree with me that every member of this House has a duty to work in their constituency and across the country to say no to this hate, and to ensure every British Jew and every British Muslim knows that they can live their life free from fear and free from discrimination here in their own country?
Mr. Speaker, all of us in this House can play our part in stamping out those who seek to cause division and hate in our society. We will make sure that we continue funding, as I said, the Community Security Trust, but also the equivalent protective security grant to protect mosques and other places of worship for the Islamic community in the UK. That funding was increased earlier this year. We will also remain in dialogue with the police to make sure that they are aware of the full tools at their disposal to arrest those who perpetrate hate crimes, incite racial or other religious violence. There is no place for that in our society, and I know this House will stand united in making sure that those who do this face the full force of the law.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We do not want this conflict to harm us here at home, and we do not want it to escalate in the Middle East, where there has been too much bloodshed, too much darkness for too long. A two-state solution, a Palestinian state alongside a safe and secure Israel, feels more distant than ever, but it remains the only way through. Does the Prime Minister agree that because hope is at its thinnest, we must work our hardest to ensure the voices of division and despair are sidelined, and that, however difficult it seems, the hope of a political path to peace is maintained?
Mr. Speaker, it is precisely because it is that vision of a more hopeful, peaceful future that Hamas tried to destroy that we must redouble our efforts to try and bring that future about. And all our conversations that both myself and the Foreign Secretary have had with regional leaders, we've emphasised our commitment to making sure that we make progress on all the avenues that will lead towards that peaceful future. And that has been a feature of both mine and the Foreign Secretary's dialogue. And I'm confident that there is willingness in the region not to escalate this crisis beyond dealing with Hamas, the terrorist organisation, but also to strive very hard to a future where Palestinians and Israelis can coexist peacefully, side by side, and look forward to a future filled with dignity, security and prosperity.
This is a crisis where lives hang in the balance, and where the enemies of peace and democracy would like nothing more than for us to become divided and to abandon our values. Does the Prime Minister agree that during this grave crisis, this House must strive to speak with one voice in condemnation of terror, in support of Israel's right to self-defence, and for the dignity of all human life that cannot be protected without humanitarian access to those suffering in Gaza and the constant maintenance of the rule of international law?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I agree. We will in this House speak with one voice in condemning Hamas for perpetrating a shockingly brutal terrorist attack and causing untold suffering on many. And as the Honourable Gentleman said, we stand united in supporting Israel's right to defend itself, to protect its people, and to act against terrorism. Unlike Hamas, the Israeli president has made it very clear that their armed forces will operate in accordance with international law, and we will continue to urge the Israelis to take every precaution to avoid harming civilians, whilst remembering, importantly in this House, that it is Hamas that is cruelly embedding itself in civilian populations.
Andy Carter.
Very much, Mr. Speaker, and can I associate myself with the words of the Prime Minister, and can I commend the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary for the work they're doing to find a peaceful settlement in the Middle East. Mr. Speaker, can I welcome the Prime Minister's decision to provide £12 billion worth of funding for east-west high-speed rail lines between Manchester and Liverpool, and his focus on great northern towns as well as cities in the north? Will the Prime Minister ensure that towns like Warrington benefit fully from this rail upgrade, and that a hub station at Warrington Bank Quay, linking Northern Powerhouse Rail to the West Coast Main Line, remains a key part of the Network North?
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for his continued campaign to improve rail services in Warrington, and he's right. We will be investing £12 billion to better connect Manchester and Liverpool. This would allow for the delivery of Northern Powerhouse Rail exactly as previously planned, including high-speed lines, which would provide better rail connections for the people living in northern towns like Warrington. And I know that he'll be discussing this further when he meets with the Rail Minister.
MP Leader Stephen Flynn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We all continue to unequivocally condemn the abhorrent terrorist attack on the Jewish people and the Israeli state. We fully support the defeat of Hamas and, of course, the safe return of all hostages who have been taken. So too, I hope, do we all share the same common humanity of protecting civilians and condemning any acts of collective punishment against the Palestinian people. In that regard, many of the images emanating from Gaza in recent days will shock us all to the core. So can I ask the Prime Minister, will he join with us on these benches and call for an immediate ceasefire in the region?
Mr. Speaker, we believe that Israel does have a right to defend itself, to protect its people, and to act against terrorism and ensure that the awful attack that we've seen from Hamas cannot happen again. And unlike Hamas, the Israelis, including the President, have made it clear that their armed forces will operate in accordance with international law, and we will continue to urge the Israelis to take every precaution to avoid harming civilians.
Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, my ask for a ceasefire is done with all sincerity to protect civilians, but also to ensure that we have the safe creation of humanitarian corridors. Humanitarian corridors which will allow for food, for water and for vital medicines to get into Gaza, but also for innocent civilians caught up in this terrible conflict to flee. In respect of those who wish to flee, can I ask the Prime Minister what early consideration, if any, his government has given to the creation of a refugee resettlement scheme akin to that previously put in place for Syrian nationals, Afghani nationals, and of course, Ukrainian nationals?
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud that we are already one of the most significant contributors to the United Nations efforts to support Palestinian refugees, and our funding supports around 5.8 million refugees annually. And on Monday we announced a significant increase in our funding of aid to the region, including to the UN to support refugees. With regard to humanitarian aid, as I said before, we are already working through preemptively moving aid and relief teams into the region, but critically the most important thing is to open up access for that aid to get into Gaza, which is why our conversations with the Egyptians and others are so critical. We continue to work closely with allies to find every way to get that aid to the people who need it as quickly as possible.
Stephen Crabb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last night, sections of the British media were reporting as fact that it was Israeli rockets that had landed and attacked the Al-Ali hospital, relying on information supplied by officials in terrorist-controlled Gaza. The headlines have since been rewritten, but the outpouring of Jew hate on social media overnight was vile. So would the Prime Minister please make the point again that the way that this conflict is being reported has massive implications for our Jewish community, and that any information coming from Hamas must be treated with a degree of scrutiny and cross-examination that is sadly sometimes lacking.
Can I commend my right honourable friend for his excellent intervention? He is absolutely right that we should not rush to judgment before we have all the facts on the appalling situation that we saw yesterday, particularly given the sensitivities that he raises, the impact on communities here, but also across the region. And as I said, it is incumbent on all of those in positions of responsibility in this House and outside in the media to recognise that the words we say will have an impact, and we should be careful with them. We are working with our allies to establish the truth of what has happened. We will do that robustly and independently, but he's right to point out,
and we will
in the same
keep
way,
abreast of all of those investigations and revelations. The time is 12:20. We will return shortly with a quick analysis of a very sober PMQs.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
23 minutes after 12 is the time, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where PMQs has concluded in predictably sober fashion. No surprises, really, were there, Natasha Clark?
No, not really. I thought his final answer to Stephen Crabb was interesting. Stephen Flynn. Was interesting when he was asking him about possible opening up of refugee corridors. He sort of batted that one back and said we've already are very, very generous in giving aid to lots of other refugee organisations, but he did not really comment either way on whether, schemes like the Afghanistan scheme could be opened up in future to deal with Israeli, Gaza and Palestinian people fleeing that conflict.
It'd be slightly odd politically, wouldn't it, to put Suella Braverman in charge of safe corridors for refugees coming into the country when all of her political capital is currently invested in getting them all out.
Exactly, and that's, to be fair, that is actually what's giving the government a huge headache over migration at the moment, because the numbers keep on going up. But obviously, Rishi Sunak and Suella Braverman have allowed many thousands of people to come into the country, so it's a difficult balancing act for them. But yes, we did just see a real show of unity in PMQs that I think we don't really see very often, and I think it only really comes around in times of crisis, in times of war, where politicians of across the chamber unite and sort of give each other easier ride, really. They give each other easier questions, and you didn't really see any real probing from Sir Keir Starmer today of Rishi Sunak, did you? It was basically just, will the Prime Minister agree with me? More needs to be done on X, Y and Z. So,
did Stephen Flynn go further than the other two there with the ceasefire? Calling for a ceasefire puts him in a different position from Starmer and Sunak.
I don't believe either of the two of them have, Keir Starmer or Rishi Sunak, have said we are calling for specifically for a ceasefire at the moment. I think that the biggest position of both of those parties, both the government and the Labour Party, is that Israel should have that right to defend itself, and that contradicts somewhat the idea of a ceasefire. Like we were saying earlier, this is Sir Keir Starmer's chance to show that he can be a statesman, he can be the Prime Minister in waiting, and I think he obviously thought that with the seriousness of events going on in Israel, Gaza, that now was not the time to do political attacks on Rishi Sunak about this.
No, although Stephen Flynn, of course, conscious of the SNP leader in Scotland, Humza Yousaf's remarkable perspective on this unfolding situation.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously we've seen the SNP conference over the last few days be somewhat overshadowed by the situation in Israel, Gaza, and obviously Humza Yousaf and his wife's personal links to the area. And we've heard some very moving stories from him and his wife about what that means for them. So I think it has sort of muted the conversation about this.
Well, it's a fascinating dimension, really, when you hear, and I know Sheila, did Sheila speak to his wife, I think?
Yeah, she did. Very powerful, speaking about her relatives.
Because we talk in the abstract sometimes about human lives. Inevitably, it's the nature of the medium. But Humza Yousaf, when he hears talk, almost of collateral damage, almost of some people in Gaza are going to have to die in pursuit of the greater goal of either eradicating Hamas or retaliating to the terror attack. He's thinking of his wife's parents.
Yeah, it was very powerful to hear from her and hear that first-hand stories of how their relatives were impacted, and I think that was the tone of all MPs today, and I'm sure what we're missing right now is them issuing that same sort of tone and that urge for calm, condemning the terrorists. Do not rush to judge the situation of what we saw last night with that attack on the hospital before everybody knows the full facts.
It's a bit late now, isn't it?
It is a bit
for some corners. How much is riding on these by-elections tomorrow?
I think, to be honest with you, the Conservatives, it's a little bit baked in, their losses, obviously. If they lose both of them, I don't think anybody would be too surprised. If they manage to cling on to Mid-Bedfordshire, which, as some people think they might do, that would be considered a win.
Because of a split between Labour and Lib Dem support as much as...
Yes, definitely, that's definitely a key part. But also just because I think the candidates have not been, in terms of Nadine Dorris's involvement in the campaign and the candidates who were there, they've not sort of shunned her in the way that you might expect them to do so. With obviously Chris Pincher and he's the candidate in Tamworth, the former MP in Tamworth, and obviously his role in the downfall of Boris Johnson and that behaviour at the Carlton Club more than a year ago, which eventually led to this by-election. There's a little bit of two different stories emerging here in terms of what voters, I think about the Conservative Party.
And there may be another one soon.
Yes, there may be another one after Peter Bone, the Conservative MP for Wellingborough, was recommended a 6-week suspension by the House of Commons yesterday for historic behaviour. It's actually a really appalling read if you look at the details of that report.
It's grim.
Throwing things, belittling, bullying, sexual elements as well to that. It was a very disturbing read. He denies all of those allegations, we should also mention.
Is it baked in that there will be a recall? Or is...
Sorry, for Peter Bone?
Yes.
Yes, so he is facing a 6-week suspension from the House of Commons. Anything over 10 days will trigger that recall petition, which means that it goes to constituents in Wellingborough. They have a number of weeks to sign a petition whether they want to trigger that recall.
Is it 10,000? How many do they need to sign?
I think it's 10% of the electorate in that constituency. Okay. So quite a large number, but that number has been reached in various recent examples. I think what Peter Bone will argue is that the historic allegations are so far in the past that the recall petition rules only came in after 2015, so he's going to argue, well, they shouldn't apply to me.
Is he?
I think that's the understanding.
Good grief, that's bold, isn't it?
Yeah,
Natasha Clark, many thanks. Essentially saying, well, it wasn't against the rules when I did it.
I think that's one of his arguments.
Even though I didn't do it.
He does obviously deny all of the allegations as well.
So he's got what you might call a pincer movement. I definitely didn't do these things, but neither should I be held to account for doing them, because the method by which I would be held to account for doing them if I had done, which I didn't do, didn't exist when I did them, but I didn't do them.
In fairness, that's what the law says, doesn't it?
Yes,
we don't retrospectively apply the law when it changes. So.
That'll be interesting. Thank you very much indeed, Natasha Clark. 12:30 is the time. Amelia Cox has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 12:33 and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I thought we'd avail ourselves of the opportunity to talk to somebody who has covered more wars probably than anyone else working in the British media at the moment. I speak of Robert Fox, the defence editor of the Evening Standard, whose analysis in last night's newspaper was characteristically acute. Robert, thank you for your time. I begin, if I may, with a slightly odd question. And also, I'm sorry for casting you as some sort of veteran. What we saw last night with the claim and counterclaim on social media, this is a very odd and relatively new development, isn't it, in the context of war reporting?
Not exactly, James. Funny enough, we had much of this, but to a smaller degree, but it was the same quality of argument about shelling of Sarajevo as to whether free market incidents were done by the Serbs or whether they were done by deliberate false flag operations by the Bosniak army. And it is very difficult to get to the bottom of them because there's only one sure proof. If they could get a substantial amount of the shrapnel from the ordnance fired, that is the missile or rocket, or whatever it was one of those two, which indicates its provenance, where it came from and who made it.
I see. So, I suppose we can add open source intelligence to that process now, which wouldn't have been around anywhere near as much at the time. So, for people wondering whether or not there will be conclusive answers to what happened last night in Gaza, you would tell them that there probably will be then?
No, I think it's extremely unlikely because I think such compromising material that there might be has probably been concealed or may even, dare I say it, have been doctored, because there was something very odd about it. I mean, this is where I hate doing a judgment straight down the middle. The trajectory of the rocket as shown on the strike, if that really was the strike, it was horizontal, not from a high angle, which one would expect, whether it was a ground-fired rocket from Israel or came from a plane.
Right.
The other thing, which I am not expert at, but there are experts, but it needs close examination, is crater examination, because that tells you what kind of ordnance it was. Rocket, multiple warhead, cluster bombs, those kinds of things.
I understand. Let's move to the impact that it has had. I mean, in terms of Joe Biden's visit to Israel, the ramifications are immeasurable, really.
Well, they are, and it shows you what difficulty we're in. Abbas has called off his meeting. That's the president of the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, and he is from Fatah, which has actually in the past been an opponent of Hamas. Also, King Abdullah of Jordan has called off a meeting with Biden. Biden has said the jury is out, but seems to have pitched to the Israeli military version of this, which gives the Arab world an excuse. And this I find extremely frustrating, and I'm not taking sides here. It gives them an excuse to stay silent and do nothing, and that has been part of the problem. It's been part of as much. It's been an in and out part of the terrible Gaza story, and it is a terrible Gaza story, which begins in this phase in 1967 after the Six-Day War, but essentially, James, begins with the independence of Israel and its successful prosecution of its independence war in 1948, where the refugees started pouring into Gaza. It's not benign. It's pretty hostile because it is dry, very poor soil, and a tremendous victim, quite apart from anything else, of climate change. Yes. But it's also the victim of the privation of really being under siege since the Israelis left, the military authorities left in 2005, 2006.
So is it naive or even silly to speak of success in the context of Biden's visit then, Robert? What would be an achievement for him this week?
To get people talking.
That's all.
One would hope, because I've just written a piece, don't think that it's party pre, but I write for anybody that believes in a free press. I've written a piece in the Jewish Chronicle this morning about urban warfare. Urban warfare, as it seems to me, being contemplated by the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force Command, is very, very difficult. In the current political, social, economic circumstances, probably impossible. The thing about it is that, as always with Israel, they think tactically, do this operation, it will deliver this. They are not thinking, and they haven't for a long time, thinking strategically.
Right.
And what they have to think is how Jewish communities are going to live with Arab communities. And we're way, way off that. We're in a worse situation than in my working life.
Well, you've preempted another question that I was going to ask you. When you use the phrase urban warfare, that's synonymous with the phrase ground invasion that we're hearing a lot.
That's what I mean.
Yes, I thought
and
so.
And it means gutter fighting, and it means how will you know friend from foe? There will be suicide stay-behind squads. If they try and use things like standoff weapons, the old flamethrower, which we've seen from World War II, and particularly in Stalingrad, the fact is it's indiscriminate, and they're lethal, and they're more powerful today. There are weapons called thermobaric weapons, which suck out the oxygen, work on an airfield basis, and just blow up the atmosphere. Both sides have that, right. and it's pretty ominous. What is worrying is I do think there's a change in the behaviour of Hamas. That this is it's zero sum. It is doubled down, and it's almost like a giant suicide squad at the moment.
I understand what you mean. So they're not fighting to survive. They're just fighting to inflict.
Exactly.
Will Biden be trying to talk Netanyahu out of the ground invasion then?
I'm not sure, and I'm not sure if he's got the intellectual firepower to do that. By that, I mean it's a very tricky one, because Netanyahu himself is a survivor, and one of the most worrying things is in the run-up to this whole terrible crisis, and it's been a slow motion, a slow burn, and it's suddenly gone. He's very much enthralled to his right wing,
yes,
who do not believe in the two-state solution. They do not believe in a Palestinian state west of the River Jordan, whether it's on the West Bank, whether it's in Gaza, and whether it's giving autonomy to the very large Arab community, just under 1 million, in East Jerusalem. And I think that when you're dealing with probably quite a bit of stubbornness, it's very, very difficult. And I'm quite surprised that they played in Biden at this stage.
Oh, really?
It seems to me to be a move of desperation.
What, on the part of America?
No, on the part
of Israel
and Jake Sullivan, who are very serious people, by the way. Very different from Mike Pompeo, who was a Christian Zionist, more or less. Would have been very different with them. And the American bringing force there is very, very interesting, because they're not talking about boots on the ground. They've got 2,000 Marines, but they would be for a rescue operation. But Eric Carrillo, the senior American general, commander of CENTCOM, who is very, very experienced at this, is on the ground in Tel Aviv, and it'll be very interesting, and he will be briefing Biden the conclusions that he has come to. What I fear with the IDF, I talked about Hamas, and it isn't just a judgment of Solomon, if I can use that. I don't think the IDF is in any way prepared, it being a citizen army in bulk, in the mass, for a very long campaign in Gaza.
Finally, Robert, a word, if you would, on the possibility of the conflict as widening. There's quite a lot of coverage expressing Biden's desire / need to avoid the conflict going global. One article this morning bringing Taiwan and Ukraine into the conversation.
And probably Antarctica and all places north.
I thought you might say that.
The newspaper columnist, and I am one, so this is a bit of self-hatred coming out. It's full of a lot of airy speculation. Come on. When you build up an operation, you do tactics, operations, strategy. It's regional at the moment. And the reason why the American two carrier groups are there is to stop Israel mixing it with Iran. That's it. Because I think if it does happen, by the way, I don't think Russia's going to come in on the side of Iran.
Right.
And will make a lot of noise, an awful lot of noise. So will Mr. Xi, but they won't do it.
So why not?
Because it's too inconvenient. It's too inconvenient for the way Putin sees himself. Is he really want to be in thrall and his best buddy in the region is a very fundamentalist Shiite Islamic Republic.
Yes.
He's got to think of his own Asiatic fringes and his own Muslim population in the Russian Federation.
And sorry, go on.
There are so many nuances in this one. There's been too much Hansel and Gretel. Do you remember Hansel and Gretel? You go to the lovely house following the breadcrumb trail. The journalist, I mean, the armchair people, myself included, have been following the breadcrumbs too much.
And ending up in all sorts of
cutouts on the way.
Ending
and
up
it
in all
depends
sorts of
who
places.
really wants to do the fighting.
Right. I think this is probably a silly question in conclusion. Then, where do you think we will be next week?
I think we'll be in another mess. I think we'll be in another phase because pride of Israel will say it's either get in or get out. And unfortunately, I think the wrong counsels will prevail.
Robert Fox, many thanks indeed. Robert's analysis in the Evening Standard, and as you just heard in today's Jewish Chronicle as well, and elsewhere. It is approaching 1:45. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Going to have a look at something completely different next. I think we found an amazing Brexit benefit with regard to British wine.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 12:48 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we take a bit of a diversion now. I think we've probably earned it. There are developments afoot in the world of wine, which are being reported as post-Brexit benefits by the government and a post-Brexit move by some other media. The BBC deploys that headline. We often turn at times like this to Daniel Lambert, a wine importer of several decades provenance, because he obviously does it for a living rather than merely trying to work out from slightly cryptic government pronouncements or elsewhere what precisely is underway. So start with the description of what the government is claiming is happening, if you would, Daniel.
First of all, morning, James. Nice to speak to you again.
Likewise. You can call me Brian if you want.
Yeah, Freudian slip there. Anyway, basically they're proclaiming that since Brexit, they've simplified the process of wine production and importation in their statement this morning, which is, how can I put this? Frankly, not true.
Right. In what way? So, what is the claim that is the specifics of it that you're
the specifics are that they're less red tape, less EU red tape for wine production and importation, which couldn't be further from the truth. This morning they announced the main three things in their document to which they're actually referring, but of course they've written it in such a way that nobody really knows what they're talking about. They're actually referring to EU legislation that's currently being used for wine production. That's what they're referring to. So to put it into context, the UK currently produces around about 12 million bottles of wine a year, which is 1 day's consumption for the total UK consumption, i.e. wine production in the UK.
Is that small an issue?
Yeah. Indeed. It makes you wonder why they even bothered producing the poster in the first place.
Yes.
But there we are. It also begs the question, if for something that's so insignificant in terms of financial benefit to the UK public, why do they need to lie about it? I mean, you could tell the truth. That would be novel.
Well, you know why? Because they're trying to claim that it's something that they can only do as a consequence of us having left the European Union, aren't they?
Well, they're trying to claim that, but the actual claim is that they've simplified processes, which isn't true. Since we left the EU, the processes for importing wine, as I have discussed many, many times before with many, many people, have become incredibly complex. You now have a cartel of brokers that basically charge whatever they feel like to importers, which the poor old general public are having to pay for. In terms of this actual statement today, it's referring to the labelling and the wine production in the UK. So what they've actually done, there's two things here. They've actually made it one of the few good things. You can now dual label with both EU and UK importers on the bottle. The detail is still unknown as to how that will happen.
Okay.
They're actually saying that it will be retailers' addresses that will go on there, which of course is a very bad thing. It should be the primary importer, because the importer details go on the bottle when the wine's actually produced at a winery, rather than some poor so-and-so having to do it in their warehouse, but that's another story. The downside of this is that they've basically changed wine into water.
Well, this is the bit that took a bit of a double take. Explain.
Okay, so when you think about wine, most people in their mind will think of grapes. I certainly think of grapes. I think of rolling hills full of vineyards with grapes growing happily. That's what I think of as where wine comes from. What the government have basically proposed is they've changed the legal identity for the word wine. So what they've done is they've basically said that the secondary waste product that you get from wine in production can now be reconstituted to create wine.
What, like a wine-based drink?
Precisely. So it's not wine. So it's a question of when is a wine not a wine? When the government interfere. That's the answer.
I'm confused now. So I think of it as being the fermentation of grape juice.
Yes.
And then you could remove the alcohol and call it an alcohol-free wine. Could
Correct.
you? There's no problem doing that. So what is the new thing that's going to be on the market that
Okay, so it's getting quite technical. Basically, when you have a wine production, you take your grapes from the vine, you put them in a vineyard, you press them, you get the juice, and you're left with the skins. You're left with skins, you're left with seeds, you're left with sticks, and all of that stuff. That's basically the wastage that normally will go off to be put into fertilizer.
Or can you make Retsina out of it? Can't you?
Well, that is one thing that can be done, but there is a bit of pulp in there.
Yeah.
What they're proposing is that this waste product that's currently thrown away as fertilizer is reconstituted by adding the three. Good question. Why? I mean, why would you want to do this?
But would someone have lobbied for this? Is someone trying to corner the market in wine detritus?
It's about money. It's about having low, and I inverted commas, wine-produced products in the UK.
Right.
Because the government interfere in wine the whole time, because they put the biggest duty increase on wine in the last 50 years in August, raising it from £2.23 to £2.68, and then put VAT on top of that, they needed to have something for the poorer people that couldn't afford to basically pay this higher duty, which then goes back to Rishi's fantastic 27-tier system of taxation on wine when we went from 1. So what they're basically trying to do is introduce create a new product that nobody actually wants.
But this is what I'm pushing you towards. This is what I was trying to work out. So let me try and demonstrate whether I've understood it or not. So because wine is expensive, presumably elements of the industry, the manufacturing or the production industry, elements of the industry are keen to bring customers who are being priced out of the market back into the fold by selling them something that they couldn't currently call wine.
Correct.
Have you?
Indeed.
Now, I'm not impartial to it, but the problem with Retsina, Daniel, is that it's a bit like limoncello, isn't it? It's delicious when you're on holiday, surveying the sea. But when you get home and it's a wet Tuesday night in Hartlepool, it's the last thing you want, really.
Well, I'd be more concerned about your head the following morning.
That's also true. But I'm just pointing out that Retsina is a recognised tipple. Is what they're trying to introduce, and it's distinguished from wine, of course, which is why it's not called Crassi in Greece. It's called Retsina. But here it would be something made out of twigs and grape skins that are then fermented, or
you have to remember wine is a very simple thing. It's pulp or water, alcohol, sugar. That's basically the constituent parts of wine. That's what wine is. Obviously, natural wine grows on a vine. It's natural. It's nature. It's all lovely and it's great for you. And people should drink more wine, in my opinion. But when you start messing about with wine and its constituent parts, and basically are trying to create artificial wines. That's a whole different game, and that's what they've announced today. So they're trying to say they've simplified something, but they're actually messing with the market so that they can say, oh, yes, look, we've made it possible for you to drink $4.99 wines again. No, what you've actually created is a whole market that doesn't exist and shouldn't exist because the EU, rightly so, says, no, we don't actually want this stuff.
No, you can't, nor can you call it wine either. But
they're going to.
But they'll only be able to sell it here under that label.
Yes. Well, of course, the most important point is that the UK could effectively go and buy all the fertilisers, the byproduct of wine.
Yes, from Europe.
And from Europe.
There'd be a lot of paperwork involved, though.
Well, there would obviously be paperwork.
If they ever introduce all of these checks and balances. And finally, I know this is an element of the story, but it's, I think, a bit less shocking, but no more cheering. They're lowering the legal definition in terms of alcohol content as well.
That's the whole point of it, yes, because obviously it's manufactured, so you can have any alcohol level you like.
I see. Well, when can I come to a tasting? When are you going to lay on a tasting of this stuff?
I have plenty of tastings. I'll send you the details.
No, not that. I mean of this new muck that they're knocking out.
Well, they won't be knocking it out. It will be. How can I put it? Less salubrious producers in the UK that want to manufacture something new and exciting.
Okay, well, you could make a career in this. Finally, is this good news or bad news or no news that they're also going to relax the rules on the shape of bottles that wine can be served in?
Again, it's no news. I didn't even know that'd come out. I mean, really, why? Who cares?
Not me. But the mandatory use of mushroom-shaped corks with foil sheaths for sparkling wine will also be dropped.
Yes, well, I mean,
but I bought sparkling wine that doesn't have a mushroom-shaped cork with a foil sheath recently. You get them like they've got on old bottles of pop. You can get the metal on some quite nice Italian wines. You can get the metal lid, can't you?
That's because they're not particularly physical. It's all to do with pressure in the bottle. Yes. It's all to do with pressure in the bottle. I would very much want to keep a thing that keeps the pressure in a bottle of champagne in the bottle rather than spraying in my face. But hey, call me old-fashioned.
I will. You're old-fashioned. So in conclusion, this is a bunch of announcements that are either meaningless or detrimental to the wine trade that the government is portraying as benefits of leaving the European Union.
Yes, whilst taxing it even more and profiteering from their own self-belief that they are good people when actually they're not. They're actually damaging the industry fundamentally.
Daniel Lambert, many thanks. We'll have a cheerful conversation one day, although I can't quite imagine the circumstances in which that might unfold. And there it is. I mean, even I occasionally now am tempted to look away when I see something in a headline that begins with B and ends in Brexit, but I can't. We've got to keep telling the truth, and it's just bonkers. But it probably will, I would speculate from what Daniel's explained to us, it's going to benefit big organisations making poor quality products for British consumers that no one else would want, which in a way is kind of Brexit. That's it from me for another day. We'll do it all again tomorrow morning from 10. If you want to catch up on today's show, you can listen back on Global Player, where you can also pause and rewind live radio. All LBC shows are there, as well as the latest news from LBC. Pause and rewind live radio on Global Player, where you're always in control. Oh, that's new. Is that a bit new, She?
It is new.
Oh, where you're always in control. Oh, take back control. We're taking back control. Anyway, download it for free from your app store.
It is true, though.
Yes, you're always in control.
Sorry to interrupt you.
You're not. It's all right.
It's such a great tool, isn't it? Oh,
it is a great.
I just did that with my hand when I said that.
It is a great tool. Coming up at 4, it's Tom Sawbrick on LBC, and now it's time for Sheila Fogarty.
Thank you, James.
It's a great tool.
It is a great tool.
James O'Brien on LBC.